Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. More spooky stories. Volume 5, story number 1. Mako is a point on the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, 14 miles west of Wilmington, on the Wilmington-Florence-Augusta line. It is merely a tiny point on a railroad artery and would have remained just that, except for a ghost legend that has grown up there, giving Mako dubious fame, but fame that has spread far and wide, especially among lovers of ghost stories. The Mako Station story falls into somewhat the same category as North Carolina's famed Brown Mountain Lights. The Mako Station ghost light goes back to 1867 and the story of Joe Baldwin. In that year, a section of what is now the Atlantic Coastline Railroad was rebuilt to include, among other things, a station called Mako. This station point had previously been known as Farmer's Turnout. Joe Baldwin was a conductor on one of the ancient trains drawn by wood-burning engines. It made regular runs west from Wilmington and the sea, touching Mako and other points along the line. In that primitive era of railroading, cars were joined by pins and couplers. Joe Baldwin, riding his train one night on a rear coach, suddenly realized that it had become uncoupled. Another train was following, and Joe Baldwin's immediate fear was that this second train would plow into the free car before his distress would be noted or remedied. He therefore hurried to the rear platform of the wild coach and saw the approaching headlight of the second train. He seized a signal lantern and started waving it frantically from the coach's platform. But the fast-moving train closed in rapidly on the slow-moving coach, which had lost its motive power and was coasting to a stop. The engineer on the approaching train, paying no heed to the frantic signal of Joe Baldwin, apparently had not yet seen what was ahead. But Joe stuck to his post and to his signaling, swinging the lantern more and more furiously. The train plunged on. Finally, with a great crash, it rocketed into the wild coach, completely demolishing it. In the terrific impact, conductor Joe Baldwin was decapitated. A witness at the wreck recalled in the meeting of the engine with the free car, Joe Baldwin's lantern was waved until the last second and then was somehow hurled meteor-like away from the tracks. It fell in an adjacent swamp some distance from the wreckage, rolled to an upright position, sputtered, caught up again, and continued to sit there and burn brightly until it was picked up and moved. Shortly after this fatal accident, a mysterious light began to appear along the coastline tracks in the Mako section. It had been appearing there over the years ever since. In fact, it has become quite a fad for parties to make night excursions to Mako Station to see this weird light come swinging down the tracks only to disappear when anyone gets close to it. The ghostly performance has afforded midnight thrills to many hundreds. Summertime is the popular season for paying the Mako Station light a visit. Dark and moonless nights are better because they afford a clearer, sharper view of the light. Cars can be parked just off the highway near a country store, and then the ghost party can walk 100 yards or so down a lonely road toward the railroad tracks. The cheerful and hilarious voice of such a party are likely to drop off into whispers at this stage of the expedition. It is usually a somewhat silent group that climbs stealthily up the cindered path to wait the appearance of the phenomenal light, and then the light appears. It will show itself at intervals of 15 minutes or so, and as the watchers stand there in the night trying to dope the thing out, they are sure to recall the story of how conductor Joe Baldwin, waving his lantern desperately at an approaching train, lost his head and his life on that very spot. From a vantage point, the light is first seen at some distance down the track, maybe a mile away. It starts with a flicker over the left rail, very much as if someone has struck a match. Then it grows a little brighter and begins creeping up the track towards you. As it becomes brighter, it increases in momentum. Then it dashes forward with a rather incredible velocity, at the same time swinging faster from side to side. Finally, it comes to a sudden halt some 75 yards away, glows there like fiery eyes, and then speeds backward down the track as if retreating from some unseen danger. It stops, where it made its first appearance, hangs there ominously for a moment, like a moon in miniature, and then vanishes into nothingness. That is the usual pattern of the appearance, although different people always report seeing the thing in a slightly different form and fashion. The light appears over and over again. Weather and the seasons seem to have no influence on its visibility. It has been known to vanish for a month at a time, only to reappear several nights in rapid succession. It seems to be a matter of Joe's discretion. Stories that deal with Joe Baldwin's nocturnal trips in search of this head include one that dates back to 1873. In that particular year, railroad men say a second light appeared, and the two lights, shining with the brightness of a 25-watt electric bulbs, would meet one another from opposite directions. It took an earthquake to stop Joe Baldwin's nightly jaunt, and then only temporarily. For a short time after the quake of 1886, the two lights disappeared. Soon, however, a single light reappeared, weaving silently along the tracks near Mako Station. Folks knew then that Joe Baldwin was again looking for his head. In 1889, the train bearing Grover Cleveland, President of the United States, paused near Mako Station after dark to take on wood and water. This predated the Atlantic coastline, and the road was then the Wilmington, Manchester, and Augusta line. The night was balmy, and President Cleveland alighted from his special coach to take a stroll along the tracks. While walking along, he saw a train signalman with two lanterns, one red and the other green. "Tell me," said the president, "what is the purpose of carrying two signal lanterns?" Before the presidential train started rolling toward Wilmington again, President Cleveland had the full story of Joe Baldwin's ghost light. He also found out that two lanterns were used at Mako Station so that engineers would not be deceived by the ghostly weaving of the Joe Baldwin light. B.M. Jones of the auditing department of the Atlantic coastline at Wilmington was on the scene when the presidential train stopped. He was a small barefoot boy at the time, but he remembered well being hoisted up so that affable President Cleveland could shake his hand. He was also well acquainted with the Joe Baldwin light. Mr. Jones recalled that one night, years ago, he was with a group of boys walking down the tracks near the station at Mako. The light, he said, appeared down the track ahead of them, weaved along toward them, and then suddenly described an arc and landed over beside the track in the swamp, just as if it had been thrown from someone's hand. That was what had happened to Joe Baldwin's lantern on the night of the wreck. An Atlantic coastline operation official, veteran of 40 years of railroading, had seen the light from the cab of a locomotive. He knows of instances when trains stopped on account of it. On at least one occasion, he was riding with an engineer who saw light ahead at this point, set his brakes, and was beginning to stop when the light disappeared. 3 other Atlantic coastline employees reported seeing the light in recent times. J.R. Blinn, after viewing it from the southeast, circled and looked at it from the north. He said it definitely was not a light from a moving automobile, because the Mako light moves with a jerky up and down motion and stays in one place for long intervals. As it rises and falls, and it's sometimes visible for 5 minutes on one spot. A.B. Love saw and studied the ghost light. He said he knew the explanation lies somewhere in the realm of natural phenomena, but that he couldn't explain it. Miss Frankie Murphy was another witness. "Sometimes," she said, "the ghost light is so bright that you can almost read by it. It rises up from the side of the tracks, comes towards you, and disappears. You can see the reflection along the rails." Many explanations of the strange phenomena have been suggested over the years. The most plausible is that the light comes from automobile headlights, as cars pass somewhere in the vicinity and are seen either along a line of vision just across the top of the railroad track or reflected in some way by the steel rails or something else. But several things tend to disprove this explanation and to explode the theory behind it. The light was appearing before automobiles were in use, before the paved highways in the region existed. Also, roads have been rerouted several times with no apparent effect on the light. And some years ago, an interested group arranged to close temporarily all roads and highways in the vicinity to see if that would stop the light. Persons were posted at all intersections and points along the road and highways for some distance from Mako, and for more than an hour, one midnight, no automobile traffic was allowed to enter the area. but the unearthly light danced and swung and bobbed up and down the track just the same. On one occasion, a machine gun detachment from Fort Bragg encamped briefly at Mako to solve the mystery, or at least perforate it. They did neither. Men with scientific training have tackled the problem. People in the Mako community will tell you, but no one has ever come forward with an explanation that stands. A Washington, D.C. investigator visited Mako to explain the thing scientifically, but Joe was too fast for him. The scientist said, however, that he had seen enough to convince him that the light was no ignis fatuus, as he had sought to establish. Others have said that the light comes from some phosphorescent formation, but at the same time they tell you that what they know about this type of illumination does not indicate that it races up and down in a limited area. The Mako light never varies a fraction from a given course there at the scene of the one-time railroad wreck. It always appears about 3 feet above the left rail, facing east. Always. The people of New Hanover and Brunswick County are not among those who seek explanations. They dismiss unbelievers in the entire matter by saying that it's Joe Baldwin's light, that Joe is still swinging his eerie lantern and looking for his head. And some observers claim that they have been close enough to the light to see the guards that are part of the lantern construction. In recent years, heedless youngsters have adopted the dangerous habit of parking on top of and across the railroad tracks at Mako for a better view of the lights up and down the track. Unless the practice is stopped, Atlantic coastline officials say, Joe Baldwin is going to have some company. Next story. An icy wind raked Joe's face as a small ferry plowed across the waves of Lake Erie. He and the others who gathered at the rail were all experienced quarrymen. The boat would leave Sandusky with them each morning and then return at dusk to bring them back. The pay was good for their work at the quarry on Johnson's Island. Worth the boat trip out there, he guessed. Joe Santos remembered the first time he saw the island and how grim the old blockhouse had looked. Like a solitary sentry, it stood, he thought. The building had been built to hold rebel prisoners more than a century ago during the war between the states. A war that didn't mean anything to this young Italian who had been in the United States only 5 years. If he had acted on his gut feelings, Joe Santos might not have gone back after the first day. But there was the money. He needed it too much. There was something both sad and eerie about the island. Had a history briefing come with the job, the quarrymen would have known something about what this place was like over a century ago. Here 15,000 men, prisoners of war, spent cold, monotonous hours, worked, sang, got sick, some never seeing the South again. As an icy wind whistled through the spaces between the single pine boards of the barrack walls, Southern officers shivered in bitter weather to which they were unaccustomed, prayed to be exchanged, and spent hours thinking of how they might escape. There was no easy way. According to a report at the end of the war, during the years of imprisonment, only 12 men ever escaped from this island. Compared with other Union prisons, Johnson's Island had a security record that was hard to match. With the first heavy white flurry, excited Southerners who knew little about snow engaged in snowball battles. By October, crusts of ice were forming in Lake Erie, and the harsh, long northern winter had begun. Soon the lake was solid ice covered by a white field of snow, and the island's ideal natural security became obvious to the Confederates. They were separated from the nearest point of mainland by a half-mile of Lake Erie in the summer, and even in June and July the water temperature was not that of any southern lake. One Christmas Eve, when the island was not heavily guarded, a small brash group of Confederates stole away under the black murky sky of a moonless night. They held no aces in this game with death, and there were only 2 cards they could play. One was to walk toward the mainland in the direction of Sandusky, Ohio, which meant back into the hands of the enemy. The other was to strike out across the ice towards Canada. Many Canadians were Southern sympathizers, across 30 miles of trackless frozen lake. Survival chances were slim in the freezing weather, and their comrades at the prison never learned whether the Confederates who set out that Christmas Eve lived or died. More than escapes, the prison authorities feared possible organized revolts with the help of sympathetic Canadians. The post commandant Major Pearson wrote to Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas, "There was no dissatisfaction with their treatment which creates this disposition, but it is the result of the restless spirit of a set of very bad rebels." Well, what could you expect of rebels anyway? Perhaps their restless spirit came from the fact that the prisoners in the camp were sometimes fired upon, according to a report of Confederate General Trimble. His account appears valid, for prison records mention the wounding by sentries of a number of Confederates and the killing of several. The shootings seem to be connected with two rules: no visits between wards after 9 p.m. and all lights out by 10 p.m. On one occasion, a lieutenant, hearing retreat sounded, started to his room, and a sentinel fired upon and killed him. On another occasion, drunken sentinels fired between weatherboards at lighted candles in the yards. Winter was not easy to survive in the northern prison camps. It was a time of pneumonia and fever on Johnson's Island. The gray ranks were thinning each day, for medical attention was scant. Rations of food were pitifully small. There was only one blanket to a man, in weather below freezing. Drainage on the island was poor, and with thousands of men eating, washing, drinking water, and defecating into holes on a small limestone island, the danger of disease grew greater daily. Reports of inadequate rations for federal prisoners at southern prison camps aroused anger and a desire to take it out on Confederate prisoners in the North. When the South had food, prisoners ate. When the people and the troops did not, prisoners suffered also. It was impossible for Northerners to realize that both Confederate troops and private citizens in the South were beginning to suffer a severe deprivation of food from the widespread destruction of their crops and the scorched earth policy of federal armies. But in revenge, food rations at Johnson's Island were cut, as they were at many other northern prisons for Confederate soldiers, and thin faces with staring eyes and emaciated bodies struggled to keep alive. Soldiers who died were buried on the island. It was only raw courage and grit that kept men going month after month. Once Joe Santos stumbled into a hole that had been dug more than a century ago, and he found human bones in it. He didn't explore much after that. He just worked the quarry and sat with the others at lunch, eating his submarine sandwich of provolone, salami, and peppers. The jagged cliffs of Johnson's Island jutted from the sapphire blue waters of the bay, and the statue of the Confederate soldier stood forever clutching his musket and gazing toward Canada. When Joe first saw it, he thought bitterly of statues at home, particularly of the proud El Duce, and he stood staring up at this one, puzzled. It did not have the arrogant features that dominated his childhood memories. He remembered the Italian leader's face from the past with mingled admiration and hatred. Hate because of a war that had devastated his city and cost the lives of his parents. He had grown up fending for himself on the streets of Salerno. He knew he was lucky to be here and be able to earn a living as he glanced down at his strong, calloused hands. He guessed all countries had wars. The start of them was filled with glory and excitement. He remembered the grand words the men had shouted, how proud he had been of his father and his fine uniform. But as the years passed, many people had scarcely enough to eat, much less to feed any prisoners from the armies of the Allies. While his pick struck the gray rock of the quarry, he remembered how sure he had been that his father would come home some day and go back to work in the vineyards. But his father had never seen the long rows of heavily laden grapevines again, and it wasn't because he hadn't wanted to. His mother had told him that. He supposed those men from the South who had been here at Johnson's Island would have given anything to see row upon row of white cotton and the hot sun shining down on the fields. But some had not returned. To relieve the monotony, Joe and the other workmen would often sing, and sometimes mysteriously they would all strike up the same tune. Not knowing how that happened, they would look at each other puzzled and shrug. Usually the songs were from the other side. Joe and most of his fellow quarrymen were first-generation Italians. They had grown up cutting stone or trudging behind a load of cement from the time their young, tan, well-muscled bodies could push a wheelbarrow. The job superintendent, who sat over in the remains of the old blockhouse, intermittently reading his newspaper and dozing, knew little about the history of the camp, and he seldom checked on the men in the quarry after mid-afternoon. If he had, he might have wondered more about the place. The quarry workers were not the only men who had sung on this island. The Confederate prisoners had done so too. In order to keep their spirits up night after night, a chorus of voices would harmonize the notes of Dixie, Lorena, the Bonnie Blue Flag, and other Southern songs. These men were not to be entirely forgotten. Near the turn of the century, there were efforts to commemorate the lives of those who had fallen there. The statue called the Outlook was executed in bronze by Moses Ezekiel, a soldier under General Lee, who became a noted sculptor. It had been placed here by the Daughters of the Confederacy just after the turn of the century. The base was contributed by Mississippi. South Carolina gave the foundation of marble. On the northeast tip of the island, in an acre of trees shading a graveyard, here rest the remains of more than 200 Confederate prisoners of war who died on Johnson's Island. Rotted wooden markers have been replaced, and at each grave now stands a headstone of Georgia marble, on which is carved the name of the man and his regiment. A more dignified commemoration, but whether wood or marble, little comfort for a life lost. Santa Lucia, the quarryman's voice rang out melodiously one afternoon at dusk. Santa Lucia. When they concluded, they went on to another tune. Joe Santos noticed that it began with a strange sort of humming. The men didn't seem to know the words, but they hummed the song as if they were going to start singing it any moment. He felt his lips begin to vibrate with a melody, as they had been when he was a child humming through a comb, and soon he could feel the vibration throughout his body. There was something plaintive about part of the tune. Then the men's voices began to take on a lively, rousing quality filled with excitement, but no words came. They cast surprised looks at each other. Never had they hummed together like this before. In a sense, it was as if the song possessed them, and they were swept along by it, and the air all around them was filled with voices carrying the unfamiliar tune. Suddenly, with one accord, they stopped, and somewhat abashed, they didn't look at each other. They were strangely silent until suddenly someone struck up another song, an animated version of the habanera, and, as if by agreement, no one mentioned what had happened. Joe Santos noticed that as the summer passed and fall arrived, the humming occurred more often. Always the same tune. It seemed to happen toward evening. The men began to grow increasingly nervous in the late afternoon, and several went to the superintendent with vague complaints and excuses, claiming that they soon would leave the island for other long-term employment that was open to them. Finally, the superintendent was able to persuade someone to admit what was wrong. "It's the song." "What song?" "The song we hear late in the afternoon when the sun begins to go down." "Sing it," bellowed the superintendent, but no one would. "So you're quitting the job because of a song you don't know? You dumb wops, it's probably some opera nobody remembers." Joe Santos flushed angrily. "It's no opera. I can't sing the words, but I can hum it for you." "Well, what you know, Joe," he said derisively. "Let's hear it then." Santos began, and gesturing to the others, he waved at them to join in. The workmen hummed Dixie for the astonished superintendent without a wrong note. "And others are singing it with us, lots of 'em," spoke up one of the group. "So you think this island's haunted, and that's the reason you want to quit, right?" the superintendent said. "This island no good," spoke up a worker. "Ask him, the old white-headed man," said Joe Santos, and all eyes turned towards Giuseppe, who gazed over the cemetery. He shrugged and spread his arms elegantly. "The song. She always come when the sun began to touch the water." It was getting late then. "I no like here," he said vehemently, and lifting his tools to his back, he strode toward the water. The dark heads of the younger men nodded agreement, and they began to stop work too. Everyone knew by now that the ground beneath their picks held the bones of the men in gray who had once sung this melody. Perhaps not all were resting peacefully in the cemetery. But how did the mysterious rhythm find its way to the ears of people who were newcomers, strangers, foreigners? For days they had wondered at the unfamiliar melody, a tune so strong that with no conscious decision on the part of the men they began humming it. It was an uncomfortable sensation. Giuseppe stopped and pointed a gnarled tan finger up at the statue of the Confederate soldier, who stood with arm raised. "I think he hear it too." The old man's lips were compressed as he gazed at the statue, and his head bobbed affirmingly. While they were talking, the blue mist of evening began creeping in from the waters of Lake Erie. and a small white ferry approached. The men heard the lonely sound of its whistle and lost no time scurrying in the direction of the pier. After that day they did not come back. Sometimes, years later at dusk, when he was on another job, Joe Santos thought of the island. He remembered how nightfall brought out scores of shadowy gray figures, gliding, gesticulating, gathering among the oak trees, and he knew that they were probably still singing. He had heard them sometimes, even above the fierce roar of the winds off the lake, singing always with that wild, plaintive quality, a rousing song the superintendent had called Dixie, a song that to the prisoners meant home. Next story. In 1854, General Percifer Smith selected the site of a new fort to protect settlers against the Indians near Olympia Creek, Texas. It was a box canyon with a backdrop of rugged scenic mountains, named for Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, later President of the Confederacy. Fort Davis's position was highly vulnerable. Hostile Comanches and Apaches could approach it without being discovered. Lieutenant Colonel Washington Sewell, thinking that the fort should later be moved to a more strategic place at the mouth of the canyon, carried out the orders he received but built only temporary pine slab houses for the officers. He constructed 6 stone barracks across the mouth of the canyon for the enlisted men. Troops at Fort Davis immediately began to guard wagon trains and stagecoaches on the San Antonio-El Paso Road and rescue travelers from the Indians. Fort Davis became a key post in the defense system of West Texas. Manned by brave and courageous men, the forts in this system were strung from the Dakotas to the Texas border, from Kansas to California. There were Fort Stockton and Fort Davis in Texas, Fort Union in New Mexico, Fort Bowie in Arizona, and Fort Laramie in Wyoming. A coach on its way along the route near Fort Davis would find itself surrounded by a cloud of dust raised by the hoofs of galloping Apache ponies. The Apaches would fall upon the passengers. Some passengers were lucky enough to reach Fort Davis. Others were murdered. The fort itself was crudely built, for the first plan was to build it quickly and replace the buildings at a later time. Made of pine slabs set upright in the ground, the structures had plank or packed earth floors, roofs of canvas or thatched grass, and glazed windows. There were 13 houses for married soldiers and their families, a hospital, a stable, a store, and a billiard room. Compensations for this rough life were the beautiful scenery and a large vegetable garden for the garrison. As war clouds began to loom over the South, they also darkened over Southerners on the western frontiers. In Colorado, the gold miners from Georgia, who had founded Denver, some of them hoping to settle there permanently, began to experience a hostile attitude from families who were arriving from the North and Midwest. At Fort Davis, the officers were from both North and South, and many had gone to West Point together. In fact, 1/3 of these West Pointers would soon join the Confederacy. Relations at parties and social events for the officers and their wives grew strained. As the South came closer to secession, arguments between officers at Fort Davis who had been friends became more heated. The relationship of one of the Southern officers and Fort Davis commander, Captain Edward D. Blake, became one of cold silence, broken only by whatever orders were necessary. One of the loveliest young women at the fort was Alice Walpole, the wife of a lieutenant from Alabama. Often homesick, missing the more gentle blue-green hills and wide rivers of her home state, it was not surprising that after the long harsh winters she was filled with longing for the balmy days and flowers of a southern spring. It was April, and it occurred to her that somewhere on this desert-like land, or among the jagged cliffs and ominous mountains, even now roses might be in bloom. Wrapping herself in her long, bright blue wool cape, Alice left the house on Officers' Row, passed the post garden, and was soon outside the fort. She stooped for a moment and cupped her hand to drink from the clear, fresh water of Olympia Creek and appreciate its sparkling beauty in the sunlight. Then she headed on toward the mountains that had always made her feel insignificant as she approached them, as small as one of the calm-faced china dolls with pink cheeks and painted black hair that she had played with as a child. She would never feel at home here. This land did not have the green rolling landscape of her native Alabama, and there was a harshness in its beauty. Following Olympia Creek, she recalled someone saying that in the wilderness beyond the fort, beautiful white roses bloom. This was desert country. She picked her way among the boulders and then began to climb, thinking the flowers might be found at higher elevations. Sometimes Alice thought she detected the scent of roses. Their fragrance drew her on. Once she looked back, and the fort was now a dot in the distance. She thought of Apaches, but there were always reports of them, and she reasoned that they normally lurked close to the trails leading to and from Fort Davis. Stagecoaches carrying money boxes and passengers were more often their prey. She continued to follow Limpia Creek until suddenly she rounded a bend in the stream. Only a few feet away, Indian braves were drinking water from the stream, their horses tethered nearby. When her husband returned that afternoon, Alice was not at home, nor was she anywhere about the fort. Before dark, a party of soldiers went out and looked for her as long as there was light. A search party the following day, covering the surrounding area, checked with the families of Dietrich Dutchover and E.P. Webster, two stagecoach drivers who lived in the areas. They could find no trace of her, and her husband was desperately worried. Late one night, a few months later, a beautiful young woman was seen hurrying past the long rows of officers' houses. Her cape billowed around her, whipped by the west wind. A lieutenant saw her and greeted her. He could hardly be sure she replied, for her voice seemed to be wafted away. What was it that appeared so familiar about her? He turned to look back and walked after her, calling out, "Wait, miss!" But she vanished. He knew her. It was Alice Walpole. From then on, others began to report seeing the apparition of a beautiful woman, often near the quarters where the southern wives gathered to do needlework and socialize. Perhaps she missed them, this girl who was so far from her native hills of Alabama. None ever heard her speak. The most tangible evidence of her presence was the sudden strong odor of roses in a room, or a few wild white roses found mysteriously here or there. After Jefferson Davis ordered the firing on Fort Sumter at Charleston, 7 Southern officers called simultaneously at the commandant's office with letters of resignation before heading east to volunteer. 3 of these former West Pointers would become brigadier generals in the Confederacy. In the midst of the confusion, the commandant noticed that on his desk was a vase of fragrant white roses, a strange phenomenon for this time of year. As one by one the Southern officers presented their letters of resignation, he said musingly to himself, 7 white roses and 7 resignations. What a coincidence. The fort was abandoned after the Confederate occupied it briefly in 1861, and it did not reopen until 1867. After the Civil War, when Southerners once more returned to Fort Davis, the ghost of the lovely girl is said to have returned with them. She was most often glimpsed in the quarters of lonely or homesick young wives. And even today, whenever wild roses are found at an unexpected season of the year, the presence of Alice is suspected.